This is Al-Fadi, and I'm hoping that you enjoyed the previous episodes that we have presented to you from this new series called Exposing the Myth. With us here, of course, remotely, our dear brother Mel, who done amazing research and showed how Zoroastrianism have contributed to reshaping early Islam and many of its rituals and customs and even proper names of certain objects or certain features that are very important to Islam. Today we're going to talk about something at least, in the same theme, but maybe not tied to the previous one. It's about the question, was Aisha and Fatima borrowed from Jewish sources to link them with Ishmael? And with us here in the studio remotely to answer this question, our dear brother Mel. Mel, thank you again for this research, this fascinating material, and hopefully you can help us now with the link between Aisha, Fatima, and Ishmael.
Okay, so I suppose the thing to say at the outset, this is like a white paper here. There is a scholarly discussion around this question, which came first. It's a bit like the chicken and egg. I'm convinced that based on the evidence that Aisha and Fatima were referred to in Jewish sources centuries before Islam took them over. So I leave it to the audience to decide for themselves if you are persuaded by the evidence. So, according to this Sen, Muhammad was married to Aisha and had a daughter called Fatima. The problem is we don't have any contemporary sources from the 7th century that testifies to these being real living people. An awful lot of the hadiths depend on Aisha being a real person. There's a huge number of hadiths attributed to her. But if she's not real, then what status do those hadiths have? One objection is if people are going to fabricate stories about Muhammad because they are inventing a new religion, they're obviously going to fabricate stories that make Muhammad look good. And Jay, I'm sure you remember this line from David Wood back in 2020. So let's remind ourselves where these tales were written. So, they were written in Zoroastrian lands, as we saw earlier. However, as we already saw from the Chinese source Zhu Huan, who lived in Persian lands in the 750s, that the Zimzim, or Zoroastrians, practice incest, and in this respect are the worst of all the barbarians. So if this is true, then it wouldn't be beyond imagination for a culture that thinks that this is acceptable to write also other really weird tales about Aisha and so forth. It fits entirely in with the Zoroastrian outlook. If this was the very culture that the hadiths and the principle of embarrassment doesn't apply here, but rather the principle of self-justification, making up stories to justify contemporary amoral behavior. That's what I would argue in relation to these. So where did the names Aisha and Fatima come from? If people are going to fabricate stories about Muhammad because they are inventing a new religion, they're obviously going to fabricate stories that make Muhammad look good. And how would these make Muhammad look good? By linking him with Ishmael. So I'm going to argue that ultimately the reference to Aisha and Fatima were about linking Muhammad to them. Linking Muhammad not just to them, but to ultimately to Ishmael. So the proposal is that the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan is a 4th century AD Jewish Targum that mentions Adisha, i.e. Aisha, and Fatima as the wives of Ishmael, thus proving, if the dating is correct, that this is another of countless harvestings of Jewish sources by Islam to build its own mythology. So the wider context is we've already seen hundreds and hundreds of examples of borrowings from Judaism. So this would be only one more. We don't find examples, to my knowledge, of Judaism borrowing from Islam. Why would it borrow from a religion it considers to be false? The traffic is always one way. Now, the relevant passage found in the Targum can be broken down into its Hebrew text and pseudo-Jonathan components as follows. So, first of all, it is a reiteration of Genesis 21:21. He dwelt in Pharaoh, married an Egyptian whom his mother brought him. Then there is the expansion on that, which is the Jewish gathering of folklore around it. He first married Adisha, put her away, then married Fatima, whom, and then it's ... However, from the 4th century to the 9th century, variants of the name Adisha circulated, hence why in the 9th century, Jewish midrash known as Perky de Rabbi Eliezer, we find the name Aisha in place of Adisha. It is clear that there was a progression from Adisha to Aisha. This name was then picked up and used in relation to the wife of Muhammad, who was viewed as the embodiment of Ishmael. So here is the text from Perky de Rabbi Eliezer. Ishmael sent for a wife from among the daughters of Moab, and Aisha was her name. So this is referring to Ishmael, who, lived in Old Testament times. We're not talking about the 7th century here. So in terms of this, arguments for Targum Pseudo-Johnson's antiquity include the presence of Jewish literary Aramaic, which necessitates use from the 1st to the 2nd century sources to which 4th century Jewish writers would have greater access to. So what this means is that there's a type of Aramaic which is archaic, which comes from the 1st and 2nd century. It's in that writing which would suggest that it's very old. Okay? The argument that the presence of JLA can only be found in Onkelos, which is written in 600 AD, has already been debunked since the finding of the 1st century document, as is called there, written in JLA. Fletcher proposes that Pseudo-Johnson derives from a 1st century text in written JLA rather than the late Babylonians. In other words, the central argument against it being 4th century has been demolished by the fact that there are other texts out there that come from before 600 AD that they could have sourced. Fletcher's thesis maintains that priests wrote Proto-Onkelos in Jerusalem. The JLA they used also appears in 1st century Jerusalem. Osri inscriptions, common writings, and the Bar Kokhba letters. A literary language, it required a structure of support and an educational system for its dissemination. It appears until 135 AD in the extant literature. All of this material is coming from Beverly Mortensen's book, The Priesthood in Targum Jonathan. She is the most important scholar in this area. I think no one has done as much work on this Targum as her. So the case for why it is 4th century, this study shows that it differs from the Palestinian Targum tradition, represented by Proto-PT in 2 ways. It is 2.8 times larger, and it speaks to priests about themselves and maintaining the cult, while Proto-PT talks or speaks to ordinary individuals about their keeping the Torah. Now, a focus on the Jewish priesthood and temple practices only makes sense in the context of realistic prospect of rebuilding the temple, of which there hasn't been any since the occupation of the Temple Mount by the Arabs since the 7th century. So it would mean that it would have to be from an earlier period. She says that I consider that the writer is a priest and that he writes exclusively for priests, but this is the primary consideration. Turn to the matter of dating. When in the time after the completion of the Torah would a writer embark upon an ambitious translation of the Hebrew Pentateuch that addresses an audience of priests? The question concerns opportunity, motivation, and expectation. She says that we make this selection based on the rationale for writing a massive work directed at temple priests. Why would anyone undertake such an effort if he had no hope of the temple? Of the 2 eras, only one offers such a hope. The century CE, a short-lived expectation for rebuilding the temple arose during the reign of Emperor Julian, who reigned from 361 to 363 AD. He wrote a letter promising such a feat shortly before his death. Word of his intention had likely circulated since the beginning of his reign, so she argues that this is really the only time that it made sense to write this Targum. This was the opportunity that was given to them to rebuild the temple. At this time, the temple had been destroyed for 291 years. The new emperor, rumor has it, talks of rebuilding the temple, even though his plan satisfies a grudge against the Christians. His action functions as a real boon for Jews and their cult. The author, in preparation for the temple's readiness, plies his efforts to ensure that an eager and well-prepared priesthood stands ready to conduct all the ancient rituals. Julian becomes emperor of the Roman Empire in 361. He cares little for Christians, so he exhorts the Jewish leaders to return to their ancient sacrificial worship. They protest that they must have a temple according to their law in Jerusalem. He gives them money to do just that. The pagans help them, for building the temple will disqualify Jesus' prophecy that the temple will fall. So, in conclusion, the Targum Sutta Johnson predates Islam's expansion of the story. PRE was written at a time when Islam was beginning to write its own origin story in the form of Ibn Hisham. However, as it was a compendium of early traditions, we are still on solid ground in asserting it came before the sin. So I'm very persuaded by Beverly's argument, and she goes into great detail in the Targum in terms of pointing out how much it is really a priestly text for priests. So hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, and we really appreciate this research, and I'm hoping that we can connect back again and we either expand on this or add more to it. Jay, any last word?
No, I like this. This is fascinating because it is also the pseudo Jonathan Targum, John Berry, that also you get the story of the two sons of Adam and the bird.
Yeah.
And so you can see these are all being pulled out. They're introduced into the Quran. In this case, not in the Quran, but in this case, it's in the traditions to give some type of body to these two, their wives and the daughter of Muhammad.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you, everyone. And this is our live. Over and out. God bless. Take care. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our